Welcome to History Teller YT, where we dive deep into the events that shaped the world. Today, we're taking you on a journey through one of the most dramatic periods in Japanese history, the Sengoku era, the Age of Warring States. From 1467 to 1615, Japan was a land of chaos. Samurai clashing for power, cunning warlords plotting betrayal, and cities burning under relentless ambition. This is a story of Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, men who would rise from obscurity to reshape a nation through fire, strategy, and sheer determination. You'll witness battles, sieges, political intrigue, and the incredible human resilience that allowed ordinary people to survive in a time when loyalty could mean death and betrayal could mean survival. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not only how Japan went from chaos to the Tokugawa peace, but also the lessons about leadership, strategy, and human endurance that resonate even today. Stay with us. You won't want to miss a moment of this epic history. By the mid-15th century, Japan was already a country quietly falling apart. On the surface, the Ashikaga Shogunate still ruled from Kyoto, preserving the image of central authority that had existed for generations. The shogun sat in his palace, court rituals continued, and noble families still spoke the language of tradition and legitimacy. But beneath this fragile exterior, the system that once held Japan together was hollowed out by neglect, corruption, and political paralysis. The Ashikaga shoguns had lost real control over the provinces. Power no longer flowed smoothly from Kyoto outward. Instead, it pooled in the hands of local military governors known as shugo, who were supposed to govern on behalf of the shogunate, but increasingly ruled as independent lords. These men collected taxes, raised private armies, and passed power down to their heirs, often ignoring orders from the capital entirely. Over time, loyalty to the shogun became symbolic rather than real. Economic pressures worsened the situation. Years of poor harvests, uneven land distribution, and rising taxation placed heavy burdens on peasants and small landholders. Armed uprisings by local leagues, known as Ikki, became more common. These groups sometimes included peasants, monks, and even low-ranking samurai, united by shared grievances rather than loyalty to a lord. The idea that authority could be challenged by force was becoming normalized. At the center of this instability was a weak shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. He was more interested in art, poetry, and aesthetics than in governance. While his cultural legacy would later be admired, his political indecision proved disastrous. He failed to appoint a clear successor, allowing rival factions within the shogunate to form. What should have been a simple matter of succession slowly turned into a powder keg. Two powerful families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, stood on opposite sides of the succession dispute. Both commanded vast lands and private armies. Their rivalry was fueled not only by politics, but by pride, ambition, and decades of unresolved tension. Kyoto, the imperial capital, became a city waiting for war. Samurai gathered, fortifications were built, and alliances hardened. All it took was a single spark to ignite the conflict that would shatter Japan's old order. That spark came in 1467. The Onin War did not begin as a nationwide conflict. At first, it looked like another elite power struggle among the ruling class, confined to Kyoto and resolved through force and negotiation. But once violence erupted, it quickly spiraled beyond control. Samurai armies clashed inside the capital itself, turning what had been the heart of Japanese political and cultural life into a battlefield. Kyoto burned. Entire districts were reduced to ash as rival factions fought street by street. Temples, noble estates, and homes were destroyed without hesitation. Civilians fled in terror, carrying what little they could as fires spread uncontrollably. The shogunate, meant to prevent such chaos, proved completely powerless. The shogun could not stop the fighting, could not enforce peace, and could not protect his own city. What made the Onin War especially devastating was its length and lack of resolution. It dragged on for 10 years, from 1467 to 1477, without a clear victor. Both sides exhausted their resources, lost key leaders, and fractured internally. Commanders died, alliances shifted, and discipline eroded. Samurai who were once bound by codes of loyalty began acting independently, fighting for personal survival and gain rather than for a cause. As the war continued, its effects rippled outward. Provincial lords, seeing the weakness of the central government, stopped waiting for orders from Kyoto. Many returned to their domains and began consolidating power locally. Others seized land from rivals, raised new armies, and prepared for conflicts of their own. The idea that the shogunate could restore order faded with every passing year. By the time the fighting finally subsided, Kyoto was a ruined shell of its former self. The capital survived in name only. Politically, it no longer mattered. The Ashikaga Shogunate still existed, but it was a government without authority, a symbol without substance. The real power had shifted permanently to the provinces. The Onin War did not directly cause the Sengoku period. It exposed the truth that Japan had already crossed a point of no return. The war destroyed the illusion of unity and revealed a country ready to be reshaped by force. From its ashes emerged a new age, one defined not by inherited status, but by military strength, strategy, and ambition. Japan had entered the age of the samurai. After the Onin War, there was no moment of peace, no clear transition. Instead, Japan slipped into a state of constant conflict so gradually that it became the new normal. This era would later be known as the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, a time when the country fractured into dozens of competing domains ruled by warlords who answered to no higher authority. The old hierarchy collapsed from the bottom up. Shogo governors were overthrown by their own retainers. Low-ranking samurai seized castles from their superiors. Talented generals rose through merit rather than bloodline. This social upheaval was summed up by a phrase that defined the era: Gekukujo, meaning the low overthrow the high. Loyalty became conditional, based on strength and success rather than tradition. Daimyo, the new territorial lords, focused on survival above all else. They built fortresses on mountain ridges, reorganized their armies, and implemented strict laws within their domains. Many encouraged agriculture and trade to fund warfare, understanding that economic strength was as important as military power. Others relied on fear and conquest, expanding through relentless campaigns against their neighbors. Samurai culture also evolved during this time. Warfare became more frequent and more brutal. Battles were no longer ritualized affairs between elite warriors. They involved mass infantry, ambushes, sieges, and scorched earth tactics. The introduction of new weapons, including later the firearm, would further transform combat. Honor still mattered, but survival mattered more. Religious institutions were not spared. Powerful Buddhist monasteries maintained their own armies and controlled large territories. Some daimyo allied with them, while others saw them as threats to be crushed. The line between spiritual authority and military power blurred, adding another layer of complexity to the chaos. By the late 15th century, Japan was no longer a unified country. It was a battlefield of ambitions, where every lord dreamed of dominance, and every alliance was temporary. From this violent landscape would emerge figures of extraordinary talent and ruthlessness. Men who would reshape the nation through conquest, betrayal, and vision. Among them were three names that would define the age: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Their stories begin next. By the early 16th century, Japan no longer functioned as a single political entity. The Ashikaga Shogunate still existed in name, but its authority barely extended beyond the streets of Kyoto. Across the countryside, power belonged to whoever could seize it, defend it, and hold it long enough to pass it on. Law was local, justice was personal, and peace was temporary. This was the true beginning of the Sengoku world. Each province became its own battlefield. Daimyo rose not because of noble lineage, but because they proved capable in war and governance. Many were former retainers who turned against their lords. Others were minor landholders who expanded through opportunistic alliances and sudden attacks. Castles multiplied across the landscape, built not as symbols of prestige, but as necessities for survival. Control of a stronghold often meant control of the surrounding land and its people. Power shifted rapidly. A daimyo who dominated one year could be wiped out the next by betrayal from within or invasion from a rival. Loyalty was fragile. Samurai pledged service with the understanding that rewards would follow success. Failure often meant defection or death. Written contracts and oaths existed, but they were secondary to strength. If a lord could not protect his followers, he did not deserve them. Peasants lived under constant pressure. Armies marched through their fields, seized crops, and demanded labor. Some villages fortified themselves or formed leagues to resist exploitation. Others aligned with whichever lord seemed most stable at the moment. While the elite fought for dominance, ordinary people adapted, endured, and sometimes rebelled. Survival required flexibility. Despite the chaos, this era was not without order. Many daimyo implemented legal codes within their domains. These laws regulated land ownership, military service, and punishment. They were practical rather than moral, designed to maintain control and productivity. In some regions, life became more predictable under a strong local ruler than it had ever been under distant central authority. This fractured landscape created an environment where talent could rise quickly. Intelligence, adaptability, and ruthlessness mattered more than birth. It was a harsh world, but one that rewarded those who understood its rules. This was the Japan into which the great warlords of the 16th century would step, shaped by violence, but offering opportunity to those bold enough to seize it. As the Sengoku period deepened, certain clans emerged as dominant forces within their regions. These families did not rule all of Japan, but within their territories, their authority was absolute. Their rivalries defined the rhythm of war, shaping the political map through constant conflict. In the east, the Hojo clan controlled much of the Kanto region. They were masters of defense, building strong castles and carefully managing alliances. Their rule emphasized stability, administration, and long-term control rather than reckless expansion. To their west, the Takeda clan of Kai province became feared for their aggressive cavalry tactics and disciplined armies. Under strong leadership, they pushed outward, clashing repeatedly with neighboring powers. North of them, the Usuji clan, led by warrior monks and warlords alike, claimed moral authority as defenders of legitimate rule. Their rivalry with the Takeda became legendary, producing some of the most famous battles of the Sengoku era. These conflicts were not just military struggles, but ideological ones, shaped by differing visions of power and leadership. In Western Japan, other clans fought just as fiercely. the more he expanded through naval strength and clever diplomacy. The Shimazu dominated southern Kyushu with relentless campaigns and internal unity. Each region developed its own style of warfare, governance, and culture, influenced by geography and history. Battles were frequent, but decisive victories were rare. Most wars ended with negotiated settlements, shifting borders slightly before fighting resumed. Castles changed hands, hostages were exchanged, and marriages arranged to secure fragile peace. Then, inevitably, alliances collapsed and bloodshed returned. This constant warfare drove innovation. Armies grew larger, tactics more complex, and logistics more important. Commanders learned that winning battles was not enough. They needed to control supply lines, manage populations, and maintain loyalty. War became a system, refined through experience and necessity. Yet for all their power, these clans remained locked in regional struggles. None could break free from the cycle of conflict to dominate the entire country. Japan was waiting for someone different. Someone who would not just play the Sengoku game, but change it entirely. In 1534, in Owari province, a child was born into this violent and uncertain world. His name was Oda Nobunaga. At the time, his family was minor, surrounded by stronger rivals and internal division. No prophecy announced his future. No one could have predicted that he would become one of the most transformative figures in Japanese history. Owari was a contested land, wedged between powerful neighbors. The Oda clan itself was divided into branches that frequently fought each other. Nobunaga grew up amid tension, betrayal, and insecurity. From an early age, he witnessed the fragility of authority and the cost of weakness. These lessons would shape his outlook permanently. As a youth, Nobunaga gained a reputation as eccentric and unruly. He ignored formal etiquette, dressed carelessly, and behaved in ways that scandalized retainers. Many dismissed him as unfit to rule. But beneath this behavior was a sharp mind observing the world without illusion. Nobunaga understood that tradition had failed Japan. Strength, adaptability, and innovation were the only paths forward. When his father died, Nobunaga faced immediate challenges. Rival relatives sought to replace him. Retainers questioned his leadership. Enemies waited for collapse. Through a combination of calculated violence and unexpected mercy, he eliminated internal threats and consolidated control. He rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal without hesitation. Nobunaga's early campaigns revealed his true nature. He favored speed over ceremony, surprise over convention. He was willing to use new weapons and unconventional tactics if they produced results. He cared little for old hierarchies and openly challenged religious and political authorities that stood in his way. By the mid-16th century, Nobunaga was no longer just another provincial lord. He was becoming something far more dangerous. In a land exhausted by endless war, he envisioned a different future. One forged not through compromise, but through total domination. The age of unification was approaching. By the 1550s, Oda Nobunaga had secured control over much of Owari province, but his position was far from secure. He was surrounded by enemies who viewed him as an upstart and a threat. Powerful clans, such as the Imagawa to the east and the Saito to the north, considered Owari a prize waiting to be claimed. Nobunaga understood something many of his rivals did not. If he waited to be attacked, he would be destroyed. Survival required initiative, speed, and shock. Nobunaga ruled differently from traditional daimyo. He showed little respect for inherited privilege or old alliances. Loyalty was transactional and based on results. Those who performed well were rewarded generously, regardless of their background. Those who failed were discarded or executed. This created fear, but also intense motivation among his followers. Under Nobunaga, ambition was not punished. It was encouraged. He reorganized his army with a focus on discipline and flexibility. Instead of relying solely on elite samurai, he expanded the use of a shigeru, common foot soldiers trained to fight in organized formations. These troops could be raised quickly and replaced easily, allowing Nobunaga to wage sustained campaigns without exhausting his core forces. War, to him, was not a noble contest. It was a practical problem to be solved efficiently. Nobunaga also embraced change without hesitation. He adopted new weapons, particularly firearms, earlier and more aggressively than most other daimyo. While others viewed guns as unreliable or dishonorable, Nobunaga saw their potential to break enemy formations and terrorize opponents unprepared for their noise and destruction. Tradition held no power over him if it stood in the way of victory. His worldview was shaped by the chaos of the Sengoku era. He believed that Japan could only be unified by destroying the institutions that perpetuated division. That included rival clans, militant Buddhist orders, and even the shogunate itself. Nobunaga did not seek legitimacy from the past. He intended to create a new future through force. This mindset earned him a fearsome reputation. Enemies called him cruel and arrogant. Supporters saw him as decisive and visionary. Both were correct. Nobunaga was not interested in peace through balance. He wanted absolute control, and he was willing to burn the old world down to achieve it. In 1560, Oda Nobunaga faced a crisis that would define his legacy. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, marched west toward Kyoto with an army said to number over 20,000 men. His path led directly through Owari. Compared to Imagawa's forces, Nobunaga's army was small and outmatched. Conventional wisdom dictated submission or defensive delay. Nobunaga chose neither. Instead of retreating, he launched one of the most daring attacks in Japanese military history. Using scouts and local intelligence, he tracked the Imagawa army as it advanced confidently through Owari. Yoshimoto, expecting no serious resistance, relaxed his guard. His troops spread out, celebrating minor victories and sheltering from summer heat and rain. Nobunaga struck at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Leading a force of only a few thousand men, he launched a sudden assault during a violent storm. The rain masked his movement. The chaos shattered Imagawa's unprepared camp. Samurai clashed at close range. Commanders were cut down, and communication collapsed. In the confusion, Imagawa Yoshimoto was killed. His death transformed victory into catastrophe for his clan. An army that should have crushed Nobunaga dissolved almost instantly. Survivors fled, defected, or surrendered. The political balance of central Japan shifted overnight. The Battle of Okahazama was more than a military victory. It was psychological warfare on a national scale. Daimyo across Japan reevaluated their assumptions about power. Size no longer guaranteed success. Caution could be fatal. Nobunaga emerged as a figure who defied expectations and rewrote the rules of war. Former Imagawa retainers, including a young Tokugawa Ieyasu, broke away and carved out independent rule. Nobunaga gained territory, prestige, and allies. Most importantly, he gained fear. Rivals no longer saw him as a reckless youth. They saw him as a predator. From this point forward, Nobunaga's rise accelerated. Each campaign reinforced his reputation. Each victory attracted new followers. The Sengoku world had produced many warlords, but none quite like him. Okahazama marked the moment Japan realized that unification was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming a real possibility. After Okahazama, Nobunaga moved with relentless momentum. He turned north to crush the Saito clan, securing Mino province after years of bitter conflict. This victory placed him on a direct route to Kyoto, the symbolic heart of Japan. Control of the capital did not guarantee real power, but it offered legitimacy and visibility that no other prize could match. Nobunaga understood symbolism as a weapon. By entering Kyoto, he could present himself as a restorer of order, even as he dismantled the old system. In 1568, he marched on the capital with a disciplined army, facing minimal resistance. The Ashikaga Shogunate, desperate and weak, had little choice but to cooperate. Ashikaga Yoshiaki was installed as shogun with Nobunaga's support. Officially, the old order was restored. In reality, the shogunate had become a puppet. Nobunaga controlled military power, territory, and decision-making. Kyoto became a stage where tradition played out, while real authority flowed from Nobunaga's headquarters. Many believed this arrangement could stabilize Japan. They were mistaken. Nobunaga had no intention of preserving institutions that challenged him. When Yoshiaki attempted to assert independence, Nobunaga responded with force. By 1573, the Ashikaga shogunate was effectively destroyed, ending over 2 centuries of rule. At the same time, Nobunaga confronted religious powers that rivaled his authority. Militant Buddhist sects controlled fortified temples and commanded armies of warrior monks. They resisted his expansion and condemned his brutality. Nobunaga responded with uncompromising violence, destroying strongholds and massacring defenders. These actions shocked contemporaries and cemented his reputation as merciless. But fear worked. Resistance weakened. Rivals hesitated. Nobunaga's domain expanded rapidly as enemies fell or submitted. He promoted trade, reduced tolls, and encouraged economic growth to support his war machine. His rule was harsh but effective. By the late 1560s, the Sengoku era had entered a new phase. The age of endless regional war was giving way to something more dangerous. A single man was reshaping the balance of power. Nobunaga was no longer just a conqueror. He was an architect of a new Japan, and his story was only beginning. By the early 1570s, Oda Nobunaga stood at the center of Japanese politics, but his position was anything but secure. His rapid rise had made him powerful, but had also made him dangerous in the eyes of nearly everyone else. Old rivals feared annihilation. Religious institutions feared extinction. Former allies watched him closely, wondering when they might become targets. Nobunaga ruled through momentum, and momentum demanded constant movement forward. His enemies were numerous and varied. To the east, the Takeda clan remained a formidable military power, renowned for its cavalry and battlefield discipline. To the west, the Mori clan controlled critical trade routes and naval power. Surrounding Kyoto, militant Buddhist sects held fortified temples that functioned like independent states. These religious forces were not passive institutions. They raised armies, collected taxes, and openly opposed Nobunaga's expansion. Nobunaga viewed them as obstacles, not sacred entities. To him, any group that challenged his authority had to be destroyed, regardless of tradition or belief. This attitude marked a clear break from the past. Previous rulers had negotiated carefully with temples and monasteries, recognizing their influence over the population. Nobunaga rejected compromise. He believed fear was more effective than reverence. At the same time, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, the shogun Nobunaga had installed, began plotting against him. Yoshiaki reached out to rival daimyo, attempting to form an alliance to curb Nobunaga's power. This betrayal confirmed what Nobunaga already believed. The old institutions were incapable of reform. They would always resist change. Rather than slow down, Nobunaga accelerated. He launched campaigns on multiple fronts, trusting his generals to operate independently. Among them were men of remarkable talent, including Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga rewarded initiative and punished hesitation. His command structure encouraged bold action, but it also created tension. Serving Nobunaga meant living under constant pressure. Japan entered a period of relentless warfare. Battles were fought across central Honshu. Castles fell. Entire clans vanished within a generation. Nobunaga's enemies realized that he was not seeking balance or coexistence. He was seeking final victory, and that made resistance both necessary and terrifying. In 1571, Nobunaga committed an act that would define his legacy and shock Japan to its core. Mount Hiei, northeast of Kyoto, was home to Enryakuji, one of the most powerful Buddhist temple complexes in the country. For centuries, it had been a center of learning, religion, and military power. Its warrior monks had intervened in politics, intimidated rulers, and fought rival sects with impunity. Nobunaga saw Mount Hiei as a dagger pointed at Kyoto. The monks supported his enemies and threatened his control of the capital. Negotiation failed. Warnings were ignored. Nobunaga made a decision that no previous ruler had dared to make. He ordered the complete destruction of Mount Hiei. Nobunaga's forces surrounded the mountain and advanced methodically. Temples were set ablaze. Monks, soldiers, women, and children were slaughtered without distinction. Ancient buildings burned, manuscripts were lost, and an institution that had dominated Japanese religious life for generations was erased in days. Smoke rose over Kyoto as flames consumed what many believed was sacred ground. The massacre horrified contemporaries. Even hardened warriors were shaken by the scale of the violence. Nobunaga was condemned as a demon king, a man who defied both human and divine law. Yet the effect was undeniable. Religious resistance collapsed almost overnight. Other militant temples either submitted or fled. No one doubted Nobunaga's resolve again. Strategically, the destruction of Mount Hiei was effective. Politically, it was ruthless. Symbolically, it marked the end of an era where religious authority could stand above military power. Nobunaga had sent a clear message. There would be no exceptions, no sanctuaries, no untouchable institutions. This act also deepened divisions among Nobunaga's followers. Some admired his decisiveness. Others feared that his ambition had no limits. Loyalty to him brought rewards, but it also required moral compromise. Serving Nobunaga meant accepting a world where victory justified everything. The Sengoku period had always been violent, but under Nobunaga, it became absolute. War was no longer constrained by tradition or restraint. It was total. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga controlled vast territory across central Japan. His enemies were weakening. The Takeda clan, once his greatest military rival, was shattered after years of conflict and internal strife. The Ashikaga Shogunate was gone. Religious resistance had been crushed. For the first time in over a century, unification seemed inevitable. Yet as Nobunaga's power grew, so did his isolation. Victory bred suspicion. He trusted fewer people and demanded more from those who remained. Failure was punished severely. Even long-serving retainers could be humiliated or executed for mistakes. Nobunaga believed fear ensured loyalty, but fear also bred resentment. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued expanding Nobunaga's influence in the West, proving himself a master of negotiation and warfare. Akechi Mitsuhide served loyally, overseeing important territories and administrative duties. On the surface, Nobunaga's command was strong. Beneath it, tension simmered. Nobunaga's personality played a role in his fate. He was brilliant but abrasive. He mocked subordinates, dismissed concerns, and ruled through dominance rather than affection. As threats diminished, his behavior grew harsher. Some followers began to wonder whether the man who destroyed his enemies would eventually destroy them as well. In 1582, Nobunaga was at the height of his power. His armies were victorious. His rivals were collapsing. He seemed unstoppable. Then, in a moment that stunned Japan, everything ended. While resting at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with minimal guards, Nobunaga was betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded and outnumbered, Nobunaga fought briefly before dying in the flames of the burning temple. The great unifier fell not in battle against his enemies, but through betrayal by one of his own. Japan was thrown into shock. The man who had reshaped the nation was gone in an instant. His dream of unification was unfinished, but the world he created would not disappear with him. The death of Oda Nobunaga in 1582 created a sudden vacuum at the very top of Japanese power. For decades, Nobunaga had been the driving force behind unification, the axis around which war and politics revolved. His fall was abrupt, violent, and unexpected. News of the betrayal at Honnoji spread rapidly, and with it came uncertainty. Allies panicked. Enemies hesitated. Everyone understood that whoever moved fastest would shape the future. Akechi Mitsuhide, the man responsible for Nobunaga's death, believed he could claim control. He attempted to justify his actions and rally support, but he underestimated the loyalty Nobunaga had inspired among his most capable generals. Mitsuhide lacked legitimacy, time, and allies. His grip on power was weak from the moment it formed. Among Nobunaga's commanders, Toyotomi Hideyoshi reacted with remarkable speed. At the time of the betrayal, Hideyoshi was campaigning far to the west against the Mori clan. Rather than continuing the campaign, he immediately negotiated a temporary peace, securing his rear. He then forced his army into an exhausting rapid march back toward Kyoto. Speed was everything. If Hideyoshi arrived first, he could control the narrative. Within days, Hideyoshi confronted Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. The engagement was brief but decisive. Mitsuhide's forces collapsed under pressure, and he was killed while fleeing. His rebellion, which had lasted less than 2 weeks, ended in failure. Hideyoshi emerged as the avenger of Nobunaga, a role that carried enormous symbolic weight. But vengeance alone did not grant power. Nobunaga's sons and relatives still existed, and other generals held vast armies. Hideyoshi faced rivals who questioned his status and resented his rise. Unlike them, Hideyoshi had no noble lineage. He had been born a peasant, rising through talent and loyalty. In a society that still valued birth, this mattered. Hideyoshi understood perception. He presented himself not as a usurper, but as a loyal servant preserving Nobunaga's legacy. He orchestrated councils, manipulated alliances, and used diplomacy as skillfully as warfare. One by one, his rivals were isolated, defeated, or absorbed. Hideyoshi did not rush recklessly. He consolidated power methodically. In the aftermath of Honnoji, Japan stood at a crossroads. Nobunaga had broken the old world. Hideyoshi now had to decide what to build in its place. Toyotomi Hideyoshi ruled differently from Nobunaga. Where Nobunaga was cold and destructive, Hideyoshi was adaptable and politically intuitive. He understood people. He knew when to intimidate and when to charm. His background gave him insight into both the elite and the common population, allowing him to bridge worlds that had long been divided. One of Hideyoshi's greatest strengths was his ability to legitimize his authority. Since he could never claim noble ancestry, he sought recognition through imperial approval. He cultivated relationships with the emperor and court nobles, restoring ceremonies and offering protection. Eventually, he was granted the title of Kampuku, a civilian regent, placing him above all daimyo in formal authority. Hideyoshi also reshaped Japan's internal structure. He conducted nationwide land surveys to measure agricultural production and establish clear taxation. These surveys reduced chaos and allowed the central government to extract resources more efficiently. They also tied peasants permanently to the land, stabilizing food production but limiting mobility. Another major reform was the sword hunt. Hideyoshi ordered the confiscation of weapons from peasants and non-samurai classes. Officially, this was to prevent rebellion and forge weapons into religious statues. In reality, it enforced a rigid class system. Only samurai were permitted to bear arms. This separation of warrior and farmer would define Japanese society for centuries. Militarily, Hideyoshi continued unification through overwhelming force. One of his most impressive campaigns was the siege of Odora in 1590, aimed at the Hojo clan. Rather than storm the fortress directly, Hideyoshi encircled it with massive forces and constructed an entire city around it. Entertainment, markets, and comfort sapped the defenders' morale. The Hojo surrendered without a final battle. By 1590, Japan was effectively unified under Hideyoshi's rule. For the first time since the 14th century, the country was governed by a single authority. War between daimyo ended. Castles remained, but rebellion was rare. Hideyoshi had achieved what countless warlords could not. Yet peace did not bring contentment. Hideyoshi had risen from nothing to everything, and he feared losing it all. As Hideyoshi aged, his ambitions expanded beyond Japan. Having conquered the country, he searched for new challenges. Peace brought stability, but also left thousands of samurai idle. These warriors had known only war. Without purpose, they could become dangerous. Hideyoshi found a solution that would prove disastrous. He turned his attention outward. Hideyoshi envisioned a vast Asian empire, beginning with the conquest of Korea and eventually China. He believed Japan's hardened warriors could overwhelm foreign armies. In 1592, he launched the first invasion of Korea, sending massive forces across the sea. The campaign began with shocking success. Japanese armies captured cities rapidly, advancing deep into the peninsula. But they soon encountered fierce resistance. Korean naval forces disrupted supply lines. Local militias fought relentlessly. Most importantly, China intervened, sending experienced armies to defend Korea. The war dragged on. Conditions were brutal. Soldiers suffered from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The conflict achieved nothing lasting but devastation. Cities were destroyed, civilians slaughtered, and cultural treasures looted. Hideyoshi, ruling from afar, grew increasingly detached from reality. A second invasion followed in 1597, equally costly and futile. By this point, Hideyoshi's health was failing. His decisions became erratic. Advisors hesitated to challenge him. The war continued largely because stopping it would mean admitting failure. In 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died. Almost immediately, Japanese forces withdrew from Korea. The dream of empire collapsed with him. What remained was a fragile peace at home and a young heir unable to rule. Hideyoshi had unified Japan, but he had not secured its future. That task would fall to another man, patient, cautious, and watching from the shadows. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. When you are ready, I will continue with part 6, focusing on Tokugawa Ieyasu and the long road to Sekigahara. While Oda Nobunaga burned through his enemies and Toyotomi Hideyoshi climbed to power through speed and brilliance, Tokugawa Ieyasu did something very different. He waited. To many contemporaries, this made him seem cautious, even dull. In reality, it made him dangerous. Ieyasu understood something fundamental about the Sengoku world. Power seized too quickly was often lost just as fast. Ieyasu was born into hardship. As a child, he spent years as a hostage, passed between rival clans as a political bargaining chip. These experiences shaped his character. He learned patience, emotional restraint, and the importance of survival over pride. Where others reacted with anger or ambition, Ieyasu observed and endured. As an adult, Ieyasu aligned himself first with Oda Nobunaga, then with Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He served loyally, but never blindly. He expanded his territory carefully, avoided unnecessary risks, and ensured that his lands were stable and productive. Hideyoshi, recognizing both Ieyasu's strength and his restraint, relocated him to the Kanto region, granting him vast territory far from the political center. This move was meant to limit Ieyasu's influence. Instead, it gave him something invaluable: space, resources, time. In Kanto, Ieyasu transformed Edo from a modest settlement into a growing power base. He reorganized land ownership, strengthened defenses, and cultivated loyalty among his retainers. His rule was firm but predictable, a welcome change after decades of chaos. Samurai under his command were rewarded with land and stability rather than constant warfare. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, Japan entered another uncertain phase. Hideyoshi's son was too young to rule, and a council of regents was formed to govern in his name. Ieyasu was the most powerful among them. Everyone knew it. Everyone watched him. But Ieyasu did not move immediately. He honored the council. He followed protocol. He waited for others to make mistakes. And they did. The Toyotomi regime had been built on Hideyoshi's personality and authority. Without him, its foundation weakened rapidly. The Council of Regents was meant to maintain balance, but instead it became a battlefield of suspicion and rivalry. Loyalties shifted. Old grievances resurfaced. The question no one spoke aloud dominated every conversation. Who would rule Japan? Ishida Mitsunari emerged as the most vocal defender of the Toyotomi legacy. A skilled administrator, but a poor military leader, Mitsunari believed deeply in loyalty to Hideyoshi's heir. He distrusted Ieyasu, seeing him as an inevitable usurper. His hostility pushed neutral figures away and hardened divisions. Ieyasu, meanwhile, presented himself as a stabilizing force. He arranged marriages, negotiated alliances, and positioned himself as a protector of order. To many daimyo, exhausted by decades of war, Ieyasu seemed preferable to another period of upheaval. He did not promise glory. He promised peace. The country slowly split into two camps. Those who supported Ieyasu became known as the Eastern Army. Those who opposed him and claimed to defend the Toyotomi heir formed the Western Army under Ishida Mitsunari's leadership. Neither side wanted open war, but both prepared for it. What made this period especially tense was the sense of inevitability. Everyone knew that compromise would not last. Japan had been unified once by force, and it would be decided again the same way. Castles reinforced their walls. Armies mobilized quietly. Messengers rode day and night across the country. Ieyasu continued to project calm. Publicly, he spoke of unity and loyalty. Privately, he secured commitments from powerful lords and ensured that key territories were under his influence. His strategy relied on patience, preparation, and timing. He did not need to defeat every enemy. He only needed to win once. By the summer of 1600, the balance could no longer hold. Movements of troops triggered responses. Suspicion turned into action. Japan braced itself for a battle that would decide its future. All roads led to one place, Sekigahara. On October 21st, 1600, the fate of Japan was decided in a valley shrouded in mist. The Battle of Sekigahara brought together two massive armies, each representing a different vision of the country's future. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Eastern Army. On the other stood Ishida Mitsunari and the Western Army, fighting in the name of the Toyotomi legacy. The battlefield was chaotic from the start. Folk obscured the movements. Communication was difficult. Both sides deployed tens of thousands of troops, forming lines across hills and open ground. At first, the outcome was uncertain. The Western Army held strong positions and launched aggressive attacks. Ieyasu's forces absorbed the pressure, holding their ground. The battle was not decided by strength alone. It was decided by betrayal. Several key commanders within the Western Army had secretly pledged support to Ieyasu. As the fighting intensified, they waited for the right moment. When they finally moved, they turned on their supposed allies, attacking from unexpected directions. Panic spread. Formation collapsed. Trust evaporated. Ishida Mitsunari lost control of the battlefield. His plans unraveled as units defected or fled. The Eastern Army surged forward, exploiting gaps and crushing resistance. By the end of the day, the Western Army was destroyed. Mitsunari was captured and executed. The Toyotomi cause was broken. Sekigahara was not just a military victory. It was a political annihilation. Ieyasu rewarded allies generously and punished enemies without mercy. Lands were redistributed. Clans were reduced or eliminated. Power flowed decisively into Tokugawa hands. 3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun. The title carried real authority once again. The Sengoku period, defined by endless war and ambition, was over. A new era had begun, one of peace, order, and control. When you are ready, I will continue with Part 7, exploring the Tokugawa Shogunate and how Japan was locked into peace for over 250 years. Sekigahara ended the Sengoku Wars, but it did not instantly create peace. Tokugawa Ieyasu understood that victory on the battlefield meant nothing if it was not secured politically. Japan had seen powerful men fall before. Ieyasu had no intention of becoming one of them. His first priority was consolidation, not celebration. After the battle, Ieyasu moved carefully but decisively. He redistributed land on a massive scale. Daimyo who had supported him were rewarded with fertile provinces and strategic territories. Those who had opposed him were stripped of land, relocated to weaker regions, or eliminated entirely. This reshaping of Japan's political map ensured that no rival could easily challenge him again. Ieyasu also categorized the daimyo into groups based on loyalty. His closest allies, the hereditary vassals, were placed near key routes and cities. Former enemies who had submitted were pushed to the outer regions of the country, far from Edo and far from each other. Geography itself became a weapon of control. In 1603, Ieyasu formally became shogun. Unlike the Ashikaga shoguns before him, his authority was unquestioned. Military power, land ownership, and political legitimacy were all firmly in his hands. Edo was established as the new center of government, replacing Kyoto as the true seat of power. But Ieyasu did not rule alone. He built institutions designed to outlast him. Laws were standardized. Administration was centralized. Samurai were transformed from roaming warriors into salaried officials bound to their lords. Warfare, once constant, was now restricted and regulated. Ieyasu's greatest strength was his realism. He did not believe peace would last without constant vigilance. Every reform, every appointment, and every restriction was designed with one goal in mind: prevent the return of chaos. Yet one threat remained unresolved. The Toyotomi clan still existed. Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, lived in Osaka Castle, surrounded by loyal retainers. As long as he lived, the past was not fully buried. Osaka Castle stood as the last symbol of Toyotomi power. Massive, wealthy, and heavily fortified, it was more than a military stronghold. It was a reminder that Tokugawa rule was not absolute. Many samurai who had served Hideyoshi still looked to Osaka with hope, resentment, or unfinished loyalty. Ieyasu initially tolerated the Toyotomi presence. He presented himself as a guardian of stability rather than a conqueror seeking revenge. But tensions steadily grew. Rumors spread of secret alliances. Samurai drifted toward Osaka. Every gathering, every repair to the castle walls was interpreted as preparation for rebellion. In 1614, conflict became unavoidable. Ieyasu accused the Toyotomi of plotting against the shogunate and mobilized a massive army. The winter siege of Osaka began with brutal efficiency. Tokugawa forces surrounded the castle, bombarding it with artillery. The defenders held, but the message was clear. The shogunate would not allow a rival center of power to exist. A temporary peace was negotiated, but it was fragile and deceptive. Osaka's outer defenses were dismantled, weakening the castle. When fighting resumed in 1615, the outcome was inevitable. The summer siege was relentless. Tokugawa forces stormed the weakened defenses, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers and coordination. Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother committed suicide as Osaka Castle burned. With their deaths, the Toyotomi line ended. No heirs remained. No vanner survive. The Sengoku period, which had begun with fractured authority and endless war, closed with fire and finality. The destruction of Osaka was deliberate and symbolic. It was not just a victory, it was a warning. No challenge to Tokugawa rule would be tolerated. Japan was unified, not through compromise, but through total elimination of opposition. With all rivals destroyed, Tokugawa Ieyasu turned to his final task, ensuring that no one could ever repeat the chaos of the Sengoku era. His solution was control through structure, law, and isolation. The shogunate imposed strict regulations on daimyo. They were required to spend alternating years in Edo, leaving their families behind as hostages. This system drained their resources and prevented rebellion. Castles were limited. Armies were restricted. Marriage alliances required approval. Even movement was monitored. Samurai were bound to their lords permanently, paid in stipends rather than land. Without constant war, many struggled to find purpose. Some became administrators. Others turned to scholarship or art. The sword remained a symbol of status, but rarely a tool of battle. Society was divided into rigid classes. Samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants each had defined roles and restrictions. Mobility was discouraged. Stability was valued above all else. The chaos of ambition was replaced by order enforced from the top. Foreign influence was also tightly controlled. Christianity, seen as a threat to loyalty and authority, was brutally suppressed. Trade with outsiders was limited to specific ports under strict supervision. Japan turned inward, protecting itself from disruption. The peace that followed was real. For over 2 centuries, Japan experienced no large-scale civil war. Roads were built, cities grew, culture flourished. But this peace was not gentle. It was enforced, monitored, and maintained through constant awareness of past violence. The age of the samurai had ended, not because warriors disappeared, but because they were finally controlled. And the shadow of the Sengoku period never truly faded. When the fires of Osaka faded and the last banners of rebellion disappeared, Japan entered a reality it had not known for generations. Peace, for warriors raised in an age where violence defined identity. This peace was unsettling. The samurai class, once the engine of history, suddenly found itself without a battlefield. Under Tokugawa rule, samurai were transformed from fighters into officials. Their swords remained symbols of status, but their daily lives revolved around administration, policing, and ceremony. Many serve as clerks, tax collectors, or local magistrates. The skills that once ensured survival in combat were now redirected toward governance, literacy, and etiquette. This transition was not easy. Samurai stipends were fixed, paid in rice, and often insufficient as the economy grew more complex. Merchants, officially ranked below samurai, became increasingly wealthy through trade and finance. This reversal created quiet resentment. The warrior elite still held social privilege, but economic power was slipping from their hands. Codes of conduct, such as Bushido, were refined during this period, emphasizing loyalty, discipline, and self-control. Ironically, these ideals became more formalized after warfare ended. The memory of Sengoku chaos haunted the Tokugawa leadership, and samurai were reminded constantly that their role was to preserve order, not challenge it. Some warriors adapted successfully, becoming scholars, poets, or strategists. Others struggled, turning to alcohol, debt, or quiet rebellion. A few abandoned their status entirely, becoming ronin, masterless samurai drifting through a society that no longer needed them. Yet the Tokugawa system held firm. By removing war as an option, it forced the samurai class to evolve. Violence was no longer a path to advancement. Obedience was. The sword had unified Japan. Now it was sheathed, not out of mercy, but necessity. The Tokugawa peace was not based on trust. It was built on constant observation. The shogunate believed that the Sengoku period proved one thing beyond doubt. Left unchecked, ambition would destroy the country again. Every policy reflected this lesson. Daimyo were bound by the system of alternate attendance. Travel between domains required permission. Roads were monitored. Checkpoints enforced regulations. Families left behind in Edo served as guarantees of loyalty. Rebellion became not just dangerous, but nearly impossible to organize in secret. Local laws governed daily life with strict clarity. Clothing, housing, and even social interactions were regulated according to class. These rules reduced conflict by defining boundaries clearly. Everyone knew their place, and stepping outside it carried consequences. Religion was tightly controlled. Christianity, associated with foreign influence and divided loyalties, was eradicated through surveillance and forced registration at Buddhist temples. This system ensured that communities were monitored at the local level, blending spiritual practice with political oversight. Punishment was harsh but consistent. Public order was valued above individual freedom. Executions, exile, and confiscation of property reinforced obedience. But because the rules were stable and predictable, most people adapted. The fear of Sengoku-style chaos outweighed the desire for rebellion. Ironically, this control created space for growth. With war gone, agriculture expanded, roads improved, markets flourished. Urban centers like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto grew rapidly. The peace was restrictive, but it worked. Japan became a country where violence was remembered, not lived. The Sengoku era left scars that shaped Tokugawa culture deeply. Literature, theater, and art repeatedly returned to themes of loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and downfall. Stories of Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu were retold as cautionary tales and moral lessons. Theater forms such as kabuki and bunraku flourished, often dramatizing historical conflicts with exaggerated emotion. These performances allowed audiences to relive the chaos of the past safely, reinforcing appreciation for present stability. Violence was staged, controlled, and aestheticized. Education expanded among the samurai class, emphasizing Confucian values such as hierarchy, duty, and harmony. History was taught not as celebration of war, but as warning. The Sengoku period became a reminder of what happened when ambition ran unchecked. Even architecture reflected this mindset. Castles remained, but they were no longer symbols of war. They became administrative centers and symbols of authority. Their presence reminded the population of power, but also of restraint. Ordinary people carried oral histories of famine, battles, and destruction passed down from ancestors. These memories reinforced acceptance of Tokugawa order. Peace was not abstract. It was earned through suffering. By the late 17th century, a generation had grown up without war. Yet the Sengoku spirit remained embedded in the national consciousness. It shaped values, fears, and identity. Japan had moved forward, but it never forgot how close it once came to tearing itself apart. As decades passed under Tokugawa peace, the Sengoku period slowly transformed from lived trauma into historical memory. For those who survived it, the wars were remembered as a time of hunger, fear, and instability. But for later generations, born into peace, the era became something else entirely. It became a story. The Tokugawa government actively shaped how the Sengoku era was remembered. Official histories emphasized chaos, betrayal, and suffering, all to justify the necessity of strict rule. The message was simple and repeated often. This is what happens when authority collapses. This is why order must be preserved. At the same time, popular culture began to romanticize the very figures the state warned against. Warlords were remembered not just as destroyers, but as larger-than-life personalities. Their ambition, courage, and dramatic downfalls fascinated people who had never known war themselves. The distance of time made violence easier to admire from afar. Chronicles, biographies, and local histories flourished. Some were carefully controlled. Others were exaggerated, biased, or openly fictionalized. Victories became grander. Defeats became tragic. Motivations were simplified into moral lessons. Complex political struggles were retold as personal rivalries. This process turned real human beings into symbols. Nobunaga became the ruthless visionary. Hideyoshi, the clever climber. Ieyasu, the patient victor. These identities were not false, but they were incomplete. The messy contradictions of their lives were smoothed over to fit narratives people could understand. Memory also varied by region. Areas that suffered heavily under certain campaigns remembered warlords as tyrants. Regions that prospered under their rule remembered them as heroes. History was not unified. It was local, emotional, and personal. By the early 18th century, the Sengoku era existed in two forms. one as a warning taught by the state, the other as a dramatic legend cherished by the people. Both versions shaped Japan's identity. Oda Nobunaga's reputation evolved more dramatically than any other. During his lifetime, he was feared and hated by many. Under Tokugawa rule, he became a necessary villain. He was portrayed as the man who destroyed the old order so that stability could eventually exist. His brutality was acknowledged, but reframed as unavoidable. Stories emphasized his intelligence, boldness, and refusal to bow to tradition. His cruelty became evidence of strength. His arrogance became vision. Over time, he was less a monster and more a force of history itself. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's memory took a different shape. His rise from peasant origins made him deeply popular in folklore. He became a symbol of social mobility, cleverness, and charm. Stories highlighted his humor, adaptability, and humanity. His failures, especially the Korean invasions, were often softened or omitted in popular retellings. Hideyoshi represented possibility. In a rigid Tokugawa society, his story offered a safe fantasy of upward movement that no longer existed. He was remembered warmly, even affectionately, despite the destruction caused under his rule. Tokugawa Ieyasu, meanwhile, was remembered as the architect of peace. Official histories praised his wisdom, patience, and restraint. He was portrayed as the ideal ruler, one who learned from chaos and corrected it. His betrayals were downplayed. His ruthlessness was justified as necessary. Together, the three men became a narrative sequence. Destruction, unification, stability. This framing simplified history, but it was powerful. It gave meaning to the suffering of the Sengoku era and legitimacy to the Tokugawa present. These mythologized figures were no longer just historical leaders. They became moral lessons, cultural symbols, and mirrors through which society understood itself. Even as Japan enjoyed peace, the Sengoku mindset never fully disappeared. It lingered in values, language, and behavior. Concepts such as loyalty, endurance, and calculated patience were reinforced by stories of the past. The chaos of the Sengoku period served as a constant contrast to Tokugawa order. Samurai ethics, refined during peace, drew heavily from wartime experience. The idea that discipline and self-control prevented disaster became deeply ingrained. Obedience was framed not as weakness, but as wisdom learned through bloodshed. Art and literature continued to revisit Sengoku themes. Paintings depicted famous battles. Poetry reflected on impermanence and ambition. Even children grew up hearing stories of heroes and traitors, victories and downfalls. These stories were entertaining, but they also carried warnings. The Sengoku era taught Japan that power without restraint led to ruin. That lesson shaped attitudes toward authority for generations. Stability was prized. Sudden change was feared. Risk was calculated carefully. At the same time, admiration for strength and decisiveness never vanished. The warlords remained fascinating because they acted when others hesitated. They embodied action in a world that now valued restraint. This tension between caution and ambition became part of Japan's cultural DNA. It influenced politics, social behavior, and even modern interpretations of leadership. The Sengoku period was over, but it continued to live on in memory, shaping how Japan understood power, order, and itself. The Sengoku period is often remembered for great battles and powerful warlords, but at its core, it was an era defined by human relationships under extreme pressure. Loyalty, once considered sacred, became conditional. Betrayal, once unforgivable, became a survival strategy. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was forced by a world where stability no longer existed. In earlier periods, samurai loyalty was ideally lifelong and absolute. A warrior served his lord unto death, and in return, expected protection and honor. The Sengoku era shattered this balance. Lords fell suddenly. Clans collapsed. A samurai who clung blindly to loyalty could be wiped out along with his master, leaving his family destitute or dead. As a result, loyalty became pragmatic. Samurai began to evaluate their lords not by lineage, but by competence. Could this man protect us? Could he win? Could he survive the next year? If the answer was no, many felt justified in leaving. This was not always done lightly. Betrayal carried emotional and moral weight. Samurai struggled with guilt, shame, and fear of retribution. But the Sengoku world rewarded results, not intentions. A retainer who defected at the right moment could rise rapidly. One who hesitated might perish. Warlords adapted as well. Daimyo no longer assumed loyalty. They demanded hostages, enforced strict discipline, and rewarded success aggressively. Trust became transactional. Alliances were written on paper, sealed by marriage, and broken when convenient. This environment created constant tension. Every relationship carried risk. Every conversation could hide deception. Yet this was not seen as moral decay. It was seen as realism. Survival required flexibility. The Sengoku period forced Japan to confront an uncomfortable truth. In a collapsing system, ideals alone could not protect lives. Only power could. Some betrayals during the Sengoku era became legendary, not because they were unique, but because they captured the spirit of the age. These moments revealed how fragile power truly was. Akechi Mitsuhide's betrayal of Oda Nobunaga remains the most famous. Mitsuhide had served Nobunaga loyally for years, entrusted with key responsibilities. Yet in a single night, he destroyed the most powerful man in Japan. Historians still debate his motive. Personal humiliation, political fear, moral opposition. The truth may include all of them. What mattered most was the result. Nobunaga's death reshaped history instantly. Mitsuhide's failure afterward proved another Sengoku truth. Betrayal without broad support was suicide. Power had to be seized and secured immediately, or it would vanish. Other betrayals were quieter, but just as impactful. Daimyo switched sides before major battles, tipping the balance at critical moments. Sekigahara itself was decided less by combat than by defection. Tokugawa Ieyasu won not because he was loved, but because he prepared for disloyalty and exploited it. Even families were not immune. Brothers killed brothers. Sons turned against fathers. Inheritance disputes frequently ended in bloodshed. Blood ties mattered less than control. These betrayals were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated decisions made in a system that punished weakness and hesitation. The Sengoku era did not invent treachery. It normalized it, and yet betrayal was never painless. Those who committed it lived with constant fear. Trust was difficult to rebuild. Victory came at the cost of isolation. The era rewarded betrayal, but it never allowed anyone to feel safe afterward. Above all else, the Sengoku period valued survival. Not honor, not justice, survival. This value reshaped every layer of society, from the highest warlord to the poorest farmer. For daimyo, survival meant expansion or elimination of rivals. Neutrality was rarely possible. A lord who stopped fighting became a target. Peace was temporary and often fatal. For samurai, survival meant adaptability, learning new tactics, serving new masters, accepting humiliation if it meant living another year. Those who clung too tightly to ideals often became tragic figures, admired later but destroyed in their time. For peasants, survival meant endurance. Villages were burned repeatedly. Crops were seized. Sons were conscripted. Many fled. Others learned to negotiate with whoever held power that season. Peasant leagues formed not out of rebellion, but desperation. Women also played crucial survival roles. Through marriage alliances, negotiation, and managing households during war, they preserved family lines and political stability. Their contributions were rarely recorded, but often decisive. The Sengoku era stripped life down to its essentials. Protect your people, secure resources, eliminate threats. Everything else was secondary. This focus on survival explains why the era produced such extreme personalities. It rewarded decisiveness and punished hesitation. It created leaders who could act without regret, and followers who learned to endure without illusion. When peace finally came, it was welcomed not as an ideal, but as relief. The Sengoku age was brutal, but it taught Japan how fragile order truly was. That lesson would shape the country long after the last sword was lowered. Before the Sengoku period, warfare in Japan followed customs that bordered on ritual. Battles were often formal affairs. Warriors announced their lineage, challenged worthy opponents, and sought personal glory. Combat emphasized individual skill, especially swordsmanship and archery. Victory mattered, but so did honor and reputation. The Sengoku era destroyed this approach completely. Constant war demanded efficiency, not ceremony. Daimyo who clung to old traditions found themselves defeated by opponents who adapted faster. Announcing your name meant nothing when arrows fell by the thousands. Individual duels mattered little when armies clashed in mass formations. Battles grew larger and more frequent. Strategy shifted from heroic encounters to coordinated movement. Terrain, supply lines, and timing became decisive factors. Ambushes replaced formal engagements. Night attacks and deception became standard practice. Castles also changed. Early fortresses were symbolic strongholds. Sengoku castles were machines of war, built on mountains or surrounded by moats. They controlled roads, farmland, and rivers. Sieges became central to warfare, sometimes lasting months or years. Starvation and attrition replaced swift victory. Commanders learned that winning battles was less important than winning wars. Destroying enemy resources, isolating allies, and breaking morale mattered more than killing enemy leaders. War became systematic. This shift favored leaders like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu. They were not the greatest swordsmen. They were organizers, planners, and manipulators of force. They understood that war was no longer personal. It was structural. The Sengoku battlefield became impersonal, relentless, and unforgiving. Tradition could no longer protect anyone. In 1543, Portuguese traders arrived in Japan carrying something that would change warfare permanently. Firearms. At first, matchlock guns were curiosities, unreliable and slow. Many samurai dismissed them as dishonorable or impractical. Oda Nobunaga did not. He immediately recognized their potential. Guns required less training than bows. They pierced armor. They terrified enemies and used to noise and smoke. Most importantly, they allowed common soldiers to kill elite warriors from a distance. Nobunaga invested heavily in firearms production and training. He organized gunners into disciplined units, using rotating volleys to maintain constant fire. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his forces devastated the famed Takeda cavalry, using coordinated gunfire behind wooden barriers. This battle marked a turning point. Cavalry charges that had dominated warfare for centuries were rendered obsolete. Speed and bravery could not overcome bullets. Other daimyo quickly followed. Gun factories spread. Tactical manuals were written. Warfare accelerated. Battles became louder, deadlier, and more decisive. Firearms also reshaped social dynamics. Ashigaru infantry became central to armies. Samurai retained command roles, but their battlefield dominance faded. Leadership, not individual skill, determined victory. Despite later Tokugawa restrictions, firearms never disappeared. They remained part of Japan's military reality, a reminder that technology could shatter tradition overnight. The Sengoku era proved that innovation was as powerful as courage. As conflict intensified, warfare became an industry. Armies required food, weapons, armor, and logistics on an unprecedented scale. Daimyo who failed to manage supply chains lost wars without fighting. Land surveys measured agricultural output precisely. Taxes were standardized to fund armies. Roads were improved to move troops and supplies quickly. War drove infrastructure development. Artisans gained importance. Blacksmiths, armorers, and gunmakers became strategic assets. Cities near castles grew into production hubs. Trade expanded, even amid destruction. Mercenary-like service emerged. Samurai shifted allegiance for better pay or land. Skill became currency. Reputation mattered less than results. Even religion adapted. Temples that survived militarization negotiated protection or provided services. Others were destroyed for refusing to align. War touched everything. Marriage alliances were strategic contracts. Children were hostages. Culture reflected violence through art, poetry, and ritual. By the end of the Sengoku period, Japan had become a highly militarized society, efficient at producing and sustaining conflict. This efficiency made unification possible, but also terrifying. When Tokugawa peace arrived, it dismantled this war economy carefully. Too fast, and rebellion would erupt. Too slow, and chaos might return. The Sengoku period had forged a nation through war. Its legacy was not just political unity, but a deep understanding of how violence reshapes society. The Sengoku period is remembered through the deeds of male warlords and samurai. But behind every campaign and every castle stood women whose roles were essential to survival. They rarely commanded armies, yet their influence shaped alliances, preserved bloodlines, and held domains together while men fought and died. Marriage during the Sengoku era was not romantic. It was strategic. Women of samurai families were married to secure alliances and conflicts or legitimize claims to land. A single marriage could halt a war or ignite one. These women often lived as political hostages, fully aware that betrayal by their birth family or their husband could mean death. Despite this, many exercised quiet power. They managed households, controlled finances, and supervised retainers while their husbands campaigned. In times of siege, women organized food supplies, coordinated defenses, and maintained morale. Some even fought directly when castles were attacked, using weapons to protect their families and homes. Elite women were educated in reading, writing, and etiquette, but also in political awareness. They monitored shifting alliances and advised husbands and sons. Their influence was rarely recorded officially, but letters and accounts reveal how often their judgment mattered. Peasant women faced harsher realities. They worked fields, raised children, and endured repeated displacement as armies passed through. When villages burned, women rebuilt. When men were conscripted or killed, women became heads of households. Their labor sustained communities amid devastation. Violence was an ever-present threat. Sexual assault during warfare was common, though rarely documented. Families developed strategies to protect daughters, including hiding them or arranging early marriages. Survival demanded constant vigilance. The Sengoku era tested women relentlessly. Yet without their resilience, no clan could endure long enough to matter. They were not passive victims of history. They were its quiet engineers. Family during the Sengoku period was both a source of strength and a weapon. Loyalty was enforced not just through oaths, but through blood. Hostage-taking became standard practice. Sons, daughters, wives, and siblings were exchanged to guarantee obedience. Living as a hostage was psychologically brutal. Children were raised among rivals, treated well when relations were stable, and threatened when alliances faltered. Some hostages grew close to their captors. Others lived under constant fear. Many learned early that affection and danger could coexist. Inheritance disputes were another source of violence. Succession was rarely smooth. Multiple sons, competing mothers, and ambitious retainers turned families into battlefields. It was common for brothers to eliminate one another to secure leadership. Fathers sometimes ordered the deaths of their own children to prevent rebellion. Yet family bonds also motivated extraordinary sacrifice. Samurai fought fiercely to protect their lineage. Peasants endured hardship to ensure their children survived. The desire to preserve family honor and continuity often outweighed personal survival. Adoption became a strategic tool. Heirs were adopted to secure alliances or ensure capable leadership. Blood mattered less than continuity. This flexibility allowed clans to survive losses that would have destroyed more rigid systems. The constant threat of extinction shaped behavior. Families planned for collapse as much as success. Hidden escape routes, secret documents, and contingency marriages were common. In a world where power shifted violently, family was both shield and vulnerability. Protecting it required constant compromise. For most people, the Sengoku period was not about glory or ambition. It was about enduring another season. Villagers lived between armies, never knowing which banner would arrive next. Fields were planted knowing they might be destroyed before harvest. Daily life revolved around preparation. Food was stored secretly. Valuables were buried. Homes were built to be abandoned quickly. Oral warnings traveled faster than official news. When armies approached, people fled to forests or mountains, returning only after the danger passed. Markets adapted to instability. Traders followed armies, selling food, weapons, and supplies. Others avoided conflict zones entirely. Trade routes shifted constantly, responding to war's unpredictable flow. Religion provided comfort and structure. Prayers were offered not for victory, but for survival. Temples served as shelters, though they were not always safe. Faith helped people make sense of suffering that seemed endless. Children grew up surrounded by violence. They learned early how to hide, obey soldiers, and endure loss. Many never knew a peaceful childhood. This shaped a generation hardened by necessity. Yet, even amid destruction, culture persisted. Songs, stories, and festivals continued when possible. These moments offered brief relief and reinforced community bonds. Life did not stop. It adapted. The Sengoku period was not only an age of warlords. It was an age of endurance. Millions survived not through power, but through resilience. Religion during the Sengoku period was not separate from politics or warfare. It was deeply entangled with power. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and emerging Christian communities all played roles that went far beyond spiritual guidance. Belief shaped loyalty, justified violence, and at times rivaled the authority of daimyo themselves. Large Buddhist institutions controlled vast lands, collected taxes, and maintained private armies. Warrior monks were not symbolic figures. They were trained, armed, and politically active. Temples intervened in succession disputes, pressured warlords, and defended their economic interests with force. For centuries, they had operated as semi-independent powers. This made them dangerous in a fractured Japan. Daimyo who tolerated religious armies risked losing control of their own territory. Those who opposed them faced organized resistance backed by moral authority. Religion offered legitimacy that swords alone could not always defeat. For common people, faith provided meaning in a violent world. Temples offered food, shelter, and community. Religious festivals created moments of stability and continuity. Belief helped people endure suffering that seemed endless. But religion could also inflame conflict. Certain sects preached exclusivity and resistance, encouraging followers to reject secular authority. These movements often formed leagues that fought both daimyo and rival sections. What began as spiritual devotion became armed rebellion. As the Sengoku wars intensified, religion increasingly became a battlefield itself. Belief could unite people across class lines, making it both powerful and threatening. Warlords were forced to decide, control religion or be challenged by it. That decision would reshape Japan permanently. No figure embodied the clash between religion and authority more than Oda Nobunaga. Unlike previous rulers, Nobunaga rejected the idea that religious institutions deserved special protection. To him, temples were political actors hiding behind sacred language. His campaigns against militant Buddhist sects were deliberate and uncompromising. The destruction of Mount Hiei was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was a strategic declaration. No power, divine or human, stood above the state he was building. By destroying Enryakuji, Nobunaga shattered centuries of religious dominance. The psychological impact was immense. If a sacred mountain could burn, nothing was untouchable. Other temples surrendered or aligned with him quickly, understanding the cost of resistance. Critics condemned Nobunaga as godless. Supporters saw him as a realist. Either way, his actions permanently altered the balance between religion and politics. Spiritual authority would never again rival military power in the same way. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued this policy, though with more restraint. He regulated temples, restricted their armies, and absorbed them into the state structure. Religious institutions survived, but only under clear limits. By the Tokugawa era, religion had been fully subordinated to government oversight. Temples became tools of surveillance and administration rather than independent powers. Faith remained central to daily life, but its political teeth were removed. This transformation was born in violence, but it ensured that belief would stabilize society rather than fracture it. The arrival of Christianity in the mid-16th century introduced a new and unsettling element into Sengoku Japan. Missionaries brought foreign beliefs, global connections, and a concept of loyalty that transcended local authority. For some daimyo, Christianity offered trade advantages and new alliances. For others, it was a threat. Christian converts included peasants, merchants, and even samurai. Churches formed tight-knit communities that crossed traditional boundaries. To warlords struggling to maintain control, this was alarming. A faith that answered to a foreign god and foreign powers raised fears of divided allegiance. Initially, Nobunaga tolerated Christianity because it weakened Buddhist rivals. Hideyoshi was more cautious. He allowed limited practice, but monitored it closely. As Christian influence grew, suspicion followed. By the early Tokugawa period, tolerance ended. Christianity was banned, missionaries expelled, and converts forced to renounce their faith publicly. Those who refused were executed. The suppression was systematic and brutal. This crackdown was driven by Sengoku memory. Leaders remembered how belief could mobilize resistance. They would not allow another uncontrollable force to take root. Religion in Japan was allowed to exist only if it reinforced order. Faith that challenged authority was eliminated. The Sengoku era taught rulers that belief could move armies without swords. That lesson shaped Japan's spiritual landscape for centuries. The Sengoku period is usually described through battles and ambition, but beneath the violence ran an equally powerful force. Economics. War did not just destroy Japan's economy. It reshaped it. Daimyo who understood this survived. Those who ignored it vanished. Constant warfare demanded enormous resources. Armies required food, weapons, armor, horses, and transportation. Castles needed stone, timber, labor, and maintenance. Campaigns could not be sustained by tradition alone. They required systems. This forced daimyo to become economic managers. Land surveys were conducted to calculate agricultural output precisely. Rice production became the foundation of power, measured, taxed, and redistributed to fund military campaigns. Control of fertile land often mattered more than battlefield skill. Markets adapted to conflict. Merchants followed armies, supplying food and equipment. Entire towns grew around castles, serving as centers of trade and production. These castle towns became engines of regional economies, attracting artisans, laborers, and traders seeking protection and opportunity. Roads and ports gained strategic importance. Daimyo invested in infrastructure to move troops and supplies efficiently. Control of trade routes meant control of wealth. Naval power became essential for clans near the coast, allowing them to dominate shipping and disrupt rivals. War also encouraged standardization. Weights, measures, and currency were regulated within domains to simplify taxation and logistics. This increased efficiency and stability, even amid violence. Ironically, the chaos of the Sengoku period accelerated economic modernization. Survival demanded it. War punished inefficiency without mercy. While samurai fought and died, merchants quietly rose in importance. Officially, they ranked low in society. In reality, they became indispensable. Daimyo needed weapons, food, and credit. Merchants provided all three. Money increasingly replaced barter. Coinage circulated more widely, especially in urban centers. Credit systems emerged, allowing merchants to finance campaigns in exchange for future privileges. Some daimyo depended heavily on merchant loans, tying military power to economic relationships. This shift unsettled the traditional social order. Samurai held political authority, but often lacked wealth. Merchants accumulated wealth, but lacked status. The Sengoku era blurred this boundary. Practical necessity mattered more than ideology. Some daimyo actively encouraged commerce. Oda Nobunaga famously reduced tolls and promoted free markets to stimulate economic growth. He understood that prosperity strengthened military power. Hideyoshi continued these policies, recognizing that wealth fueled unification. Urban life expanded rapidly. Towns became centers of culture, innovation, and exchange. Crafts flourished. Specialization increased. Even amid destruction, economic life did not collapse. It adapted. For peasants, economic pressure was relentless. Taxes were heavy, and armies frequently seized supplies. Yet increased demand for food and materials also created opportunities. Some villages prospered by supplying nearby castles. The Sengoku economy was harsh but dynamic. It rewarded flexibility and punished stagnation. Wealth became as decisive as swords. When Tokugawa peace arrived, it did not erase the Sengoku economic transformation. Instead, it locked it into place. The shogunate understood that uncontrolled economic power could destabilize society just as easily as armies. Trade was regulated. Merchant activity was monitored. Currency was standardized. Markets continued to grow, but under supervision. Wealth was tolerated, not celebrated. The class system was reinforced. Samurai retained status despite declining economic power. Merchants gained wealth, but remained politically constrained. This tension became a defining feature of Tokugawa society. Yet the foundation built during the Sengoku period made long-term stability possible. Roads, cities, and trade networks continued to expand. Agricultural productivity increased. Japan became economically self-sufficient. The irony was clear. An age of relentless war created the systems that sustained peace. The Sengoku era taught Japan that power flowed from control of resources. Tokugawa rulers never forgot that lesson. They ruled not just with swords, but with ledgers. Before the Sengoku period, Japanese castles were relatively simple fortifications. Many were wooden structures built on hills, designed mainly as refuges during conflict. The chaos of constant warfare changed that completely. Castles became the physical expression of power, control, and survival. Sengoku castles were no longer passive defenses. They were command centers. Built on strategic terrain, they controlled roads, rivers, farmland, and trade routes. Whoever held the castle held the surrounding region. This made sieges central to warfare. Taking a castle often mattered more than winning open battles. Design became increasingly sophisticated. Multiple layers of walls, gates, and moats forced attackers into narrow paths where defenders could strike from above. Stone foundations replaced earthworks, increasing durability and fire resistance. Towers provided visibility and intimidation. Every element served a purpose. Castles were also psychological weapons. Their size and complexity projected authority. A powerful castle discouraged rebellion before it began. Peasants and rival samurai alike understood what such structures represented. Control was permanent, visible, and overwhelming. Building a castle required enormous resources. Thousands of laborers, vast quantities of stone and timber, and years of work were necessary. Only daimyo with strong economic foundations could afford them. Thus, castles also symbolized wealth and administrative capability. By the late Sengoku period, Japan was dotted with fortresses, each marking a note of power. The landscape itself became militarized. Hills were reshaped, rivers redirected. Entire regions were reorganized around defense. Castles did not just protect power, they created it. Around these fortresses, new cities emerged. Castle towns became the heart of Sengoku domains, transforming Japan's urban geography permanently. Unlike older cities centered on temples or courts, these towns existed to serve military and administrative needs. Samurai residences surrounded the castle, arranged according to rank. Artisans lived nearby, producing weapons, armor, tools, and goods. Merchants settled along planned streets, supplying food and materials. Peasants brought agricultural products from surrounding villages. Everything flowed toward the castle. This concentration of people created unprecedented urban growth. Towns like Azuchi, Osaka, and later Edo expanded rapidly. They became centers of trade, culture, and innovation. Even amid war, these cities thrived because they were protected and essential. Daimyo encouraged settlement by offering incentives such as tax reductions or land grants. A prosperous town meant a stronger domain. Urban planning reflected control. Streets were designed to slow attackers. Neighborhoods were segregated by class. Gates regulated movement. Life in castle towns was tightly regulated but more dynamic than rural areas. People encountered new ideas, goods, and opportunities. Cultural exchange increased. Literacy spread among samurai and merchants. These towns outlived the wars that created them. Under Tokugawa peace, they became the backbone of Japan's urban network. Modern Japanese cities often trace their origins to Sengoku castle towns. War had reshaped the landscape, not just with destruction, but with enduring structure. After unification, the Tokugawa Shogunate recognized the power of castles and cities. They did not dismantle this system. They regulated it. Castles remained symbols of authority, but their number and function were tightly controlled. Daimyo were restricted to one castle per domain. Unauthorized construction was forbidden. Repairs required approval. This prevented rivals from building new power centers. Architecture itself became a tool of surveillance. Edo Castle, the shogun's seat, dwarfed all others. Its scale was intentional. It reminded daimyo where ultimate authority resided. The city of Edo grew into one of the largest cities in the world, sustained by systems first developed during the Sengoku era. Road networks were standardized to support alternate attendance. Castle towns became checkpoints in a national system of control. Movement was visible and regulated. The Sengoku lesson was clear. Power embedded in stone and space could endure beyond individuals. The Tokugawa Shogunate used architecture to freeze the balance of power permanently. Castles, once engines of war, became anchors of peace. The Sengoku period was not only an age of war, it was an age of learning forged under pressure. When survival depends on judgment rather than fate, ideas change. Education during this era was practical, selective, and often brutal in its focus. Knowledge was not pursued for refinement alone. It was pursued because ignorance killed. For samurai, education expanded far beyond martial skill. Literacy became essential. Orders had to be read, land records kept, and alliances negotiated. A warrior who could not read or write was increasingly vulnerable. Daimyo began to value retainers who could think, calculate, and plan. Military manuals circulated widely. Strategy, logistics, terrain analysis, and psychology were studied carefully. Chinese classics on warfare, especially works attributed to Sun Tzu, gained influence. Victory was no longer seen as a product of courage alone, but of preparation and insight. Education was not centralized. Each domain trained its retainers according to its needs. Some emphasized strict discipline. Others encouraged flexibility and innovation. The common thread was realism. Idealism belonged to peaceful ages. Sengoku learning focused on outcomes. Even among common people, knowledge spread. Merchants learned accounting and contracts. Artisans refined techniques to meet military demand. Peasants learned negotiation, evasion, and adaptation. Everyone learned something about power, whether they wanted to or not. This environment created a culture that valued intelligence tempered by caution. Cleverness without restraint could be fatal. Wisdom meant knowing when not to act. The Sengoku period taught Japan that thinking clearly under pressure was as important as strength. That lesson would shape philosophy long after the wars ended. When the Tokugawa Shogunate established peace, it faced a problem. How do you govern a society shaped by generations of violence? The answer was ideology, specifically Confucianism. Confucian thought emphasized hierarchy, duty, obedience, and harmony. These values directly countered the instability of the Sengoku age, where war rewarded ambition. Confucianism discouraged it. Where chaos elevated the bold, Confucianism praised restraint. The Tokugawa state promoted Confucian education among samurai. Scholars were supported. Texts were standardized. History was reframed as moral instruction. The Sengoku period became an example of what happened when hierarchy collapsed. This philosophy justified strict social classes. Samurai ruled. Farmers produced. Artisans created. Merchants traded. Each role had value, but only if boundaries were respected. Mobility, once possible through war, was now dangerous. Confucianism also reinforced loyalty to authority. The shogun ruled not just by force, but by moral order. Obedience became virtue. Rebellion became moral failure. Yet this ideology did not erase Sengoku experience. It sat on top of it. People obeyed not because they believed chaos was impossible, but because they remembered how bad it had been. Education under Tokugawa rule was disciplined and controlled. Independent thought was tolerated only within limits. Stability mattered more than innovation. The sword had ended the wars. Philosophy ensured they would not return. Despite official ideology, Sengoku thinking never disappeared. It survived quietly, embedded in attitudes toward power, risk, and leadership. Beneath the surface of Tokugawa peace, people still understood how fragile order could be. Samurai literature often carried double meanings. Loyalty was praised, but so was awareness. Obedience was encouraged, but blind obedience was quietly questioned. Stories of fallen warlords reminded readers that power always carried danger. Pragmatism remained valued. Officials were expected to follow rules, but also to anticipate problems before they became crises. This mindset came directly from Sengoku experience. Even philosophy reflected tension. Neo-Confucian thinkers emphasized order, but many acknowledged that laws existed because human nature was unstable. The memory of civil war shaped these assumptions. Education became a means of control, but also preservation. The past was studied carefully. Mistakes were cataloged. Sengoku chaos was not erased from memory. It was analyzed. This philosophy justified strict social classes. Samurai ruled. Farmers produced. Artisans created. Merchants traded. Each role had value, but only if boundaries were respected. Mobility, once possible through war, was now dangerous. Confucianism also reinforced loyalty to authority. The shogun ruled not just by force, but by moral order. Obedience became virtue. Rebellion became moral failure. Yet this ideology did not erase Sengoku experience. It sat on top of it. People obeyed not because they believed chaos was impossible, but because they remembered how bad it had been. Education under Tokugawa rule was disciplined and controlled. Independent thought was tolerated only within limits. Stability mattered more than innovation. The sword had ended the wars. Philosophy ensured they would not return. Despite official ideology, Sengoku thinking never disappeared. It survived quietly, embedded in attitudes toward power, risk, and leadership. Beneath the surface of Tokugawa peace, people still understood how fragile order could be. Samurai literature often carried double meanings. Loyalty was praised, but so was awareness. Obedience was encouraged, but blind obedience was quietly questioned. Stories of fallen warlords reminded readers that power always carried danger. Pragmatism remained valued. Officials were expected to follow rules, but also to anticipate problems before they became crises. This mindset came directly from Sengoku experience. Even philosophy reflected tension. Neo-Confucian thinkers emphasized order, but many acknowledged that laws existed because human nature was unstable. The memory of civil war shaped these assumptions. Education became a means of control, but also preservation. The past was studied carefully. Mistakes were cataloged. Sengoku chaos was not erased from memory. It was analyzed. The result was a society that appeared rigid, but was deeply aware of instability beneath the surface. Calm was maintained not through ignorance, but through constant awareness of what could return. The Sengoku age taught Japan to think cautiously, act deliberately, and fear disorder more than injustice. That mental legacy lasted far longer than the wars themselves. The Sengoku period created leaders unlike any in previous Japanese history. Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu were not merely warriors. They were innovators, strategists, and visionaries molded by relentless warfare. Their leadership styles were forged by necessity. Chaos demanded decisiveness, observation, and the ability to adapt instantly. Nobunaga's leadership was defined by ruthlessness and speed. He embraced innovation and disregarded tradition when it conflicted with results. His decisiveness made him unpredictable, feared, and respected. Subordinates understood that hesitating or failure could be fatal. His leadership taught Japan that vision without action was meaningless and that authority required both intellect and the capacity for violence. Hideyoshi's approach was different, but equally influential. Rising from peasantry, he relied on intelligence, persuasion, and adaptability. He understood human psychology, rewarding loyalty and exploiting fear. Hideyoshi demonstrated that leadership was not just about birthright or skill with a sword, but about understanding people and using networks strategically. His governance emphasized centralization, coordination, and the ability to consolidate power smoothly, showing that organization could be as decisive as battlefield brilliance. Ieyasu exemplified patience. He understood that survival could be more powerful than ambition. While others acted aggressively, he bided his time, prepared contingencies, and observed rivals carefully. Sekigahara was not won by sheer force alone. It was won by calculated strategy, timing, and manipulation. Ieyasu's leadership highlighted the importance of foresight, patience, and long-term planning in consolidating authority. Together, these leaders established the model of Japanese leadership in practice. Authority had to combine strength, intelligence, and adaptability. The Sengoku period demonstrated that the most effective leader could read people, understand resources, and anticipate change. These lessons influenced governance far beyond the era of war. Discipline became central to survival during the Sengoku period, and this principle carried forward into Tokugawa rule. On the battlefield, untrained or disorganized troops could be annihilated within minutes. Armies had to be structured with clear hierarchies, communication channels, and standardized tactics. Leaders enforced training and loyalty rigorously. Even small mistakes could cost lives. This emphasis on discipline extended beyond the military. Civil administration, taxation, and justice all relied on obedience and predictable execution. Daimyo who successfully integrated military discipline into governance survived, while those who neglected order fell to rivals. Control, in this sense, was both a practical and moral virtue. Sengoku-era philosophy reinforced this understanding. Samurai codes like Bushido emerged as ideals, combining martial prowess with ethical conduct, loyalty, and self-control. Although often romanticized later, these codes were born from necessity. Soldiers who could restrain impulses, follow orders, and prioritize strategy over emotion were more likely to survive the chaos of constant war. Discipline became inseparable from authority. Tokugawa Ieyasu institutionalized these lessons. Samurai were bound to service, trained in administration as well as combat, and placed under surveillance through systems like alternate attendants. Even peasants and merchants were governed with predictable laws and obligations. Japan's society became a controlled organism, with discipline embedded at every level. The legacy was profound. For centuries, Japanese leaders understood that stability depended on enforcing structure, cultivating loyalty, and integrating discipline into every aspect of governance. The lessons of war became tools of peace. The Sengoku period also transformed Japanese ideas of strategic thinking. Survival was rarely guaranteed. Power shifted rapidly. Leaders, samurai, and common people alike had to learn to anticipate change, exploit opportunity, and adapt instantly. Strategy extended beyond the battlefield. Political negotiation, marriage alliances, economic planning, and psychological warfare all became essential. A single miscalculation could mean death, the loss of a clan, or famine for hundreds. Leaders like Nobunaga and Hideyoshi mastered multidimensional strategy, balancing diplomacy, logistics, and combat simultaneously. Even Ieyasu, patient as he was, relied on foresight and planning to manipulate outcomes. This adaptability became a cultural value. Planning, observation, and flexible problem-solving were celebrated. The ability to pivot when circumstances changed was admired. Mistakes were harshly punished, creating a society highly sensitive to risk and opportunity. By embedding these lessons into both governance and culture, the Sengoku period left Japan with a strategic mindset that persisted long after the last battles. Leaders learned to value intelligence as much as courage. Civil administration mirrored battlefield tactics. Every move was calculated. Every action had consequences. In this way, the Sengoku period shaped not only Japan's military history, but its political psychology. Leadership, discipline, and strategy became inseparable, influencing governance, social conduct, and even modern perceptions of power. The era of chaos produced a society attuned to authority, planning, and the delicate balance between ambition and survival. The Sengoku period was an age of violence and instability, yet from its destruction emerged a unique cultural richness. When survival demanded constant vigilance and battle consumed everyday life, art and culture became a refuge and a form of control. Samurai, daimyo, and common people alike turned to creative expression not only for comfort, but also for identity and prestige. The warlords themselves were patrons of culture. Oda Nobunaga, despite his ruthless campaigns, valued architecture, painting, tea ceremonies, and music. He rebuilt cities with a sense of aesthetic in mind, commissioning grand castles and gardens that impressed both allies and rivals. Nobunaga's leadership demonstrated that culture could serve political purposes. It displayed wealth, sophistication, and control, signaling power without a sword. Toyotomi Hideyoshi extended this vision. Coming from a humble background, he used culture to legitimize authority and unify society. He held grand tea ceremonies, sponsored artisans, and rebuilt destroyed temples and towns. His rule highlighted the connection between artistry and governance. Refined taste became a marker of legitimate power. Ceremonies and artistic patronage reinforced hierarchy, disciplined behavior, and loyalty, turning cultural engagement into a subtle instrument of social order. Even amidst ongoing war, villages and towns produced literature, crafts, and performing arts. Storytelling flourished as oral histories recounted battles, betrayals, and heroism. Craftsmen developed specialized weapons, armor, textiles, and ceramics, combining functionality with artistry. The Sengoku period, despite its violence, produced an era of innovation, leaving a lasting imprint on Japanese aesthetic and cultural sensibilities. Literature became a vital tool for recording, interpreting, and mythologizing the Sengoku period. Chronicles of battles, biographies of daimyo, and poetic reflections of warriors provided both history and guidance. These texts often blurred fact and legend, crafting narratives that were simultaneously cautionary tales and celebratory accounts. Theatrical forms such as No, Kabuki, and Bunraku adapted Sengoku stories, dramatizing heroism, betrayal, and tragedy for public audiences. Kabuki, in particular, transformed the era's violence in a stylized spectacle. Samurai deeds, ethical dilemmas, and political intrigue were performed on stage, allowing the population to engage with history safely. These performances provided communal memory, teaching lessons about loyalty, ambition, and the consequences of power through art. Poetry also reflected the period's turbulence. Many samurai composed waka and renga that meditated on impermanence, mortality, and the fragility of human plans. These works often drew directly from battlefield experiences or the destruction of villages and castles. Art and literature became a lens to interpret chaos, transforming personal trauma into enduring narrative. Through literature and theater, the Sengoku era was encoded into Japanese culture. Memory of the period was preserved not just as historical record, but as ethical, aesthetic, and emotional knowledge for generations who would never experience war firsthand. Tea ceremonies, gardens, and architecture became extensions of Sengoku politics. The tea ceremony, or shinoyu, evolved during the late Sengoku period into a precise ritual embodying control, taste, and hierarchy. Warlords used these ceremonies to display refinement, assert dominance, and negotiate alliances. The smallest detail, the choice of vessel, the arrangement of flowers, the order of service, was deliberate, signaling sophistication and power. Castles and gardens were designed with dual purposes: practical defense and visual authority. Stone walls and moats protected cities, while carefully curated landscapes communicated stability and control. The architecture projected a vision of order in contrast to the chaos of war. By visiting or commissioning these spaces, daimyo could display both wealth and intellect, reinforcing social hierarchy and political legitimacy. Artisans, too, adapted to the era's demands. Ceramics, lacquerware, textiles, and weapon ornamentation became both functional and symbolic. Elite swords were as much status symbols as weapons, intricately crafted to impress allies and intimidate enemies. Paintings captured scenes of battles, legendary deeds, and landscapes, blending reality with stylization. Even in a time dominated by survival and destruction, creativity flourished, offering aesthetic solutions to political and personal challenges. The cultural achievements of the Sengoku period endured into the Tokugawa era, shaping Japanese aesthetics, architecture, and artistic practice for centuries. In essence, the violence of the period created a deep appreciation for control, beauty, and refinement, a paradoxical but enduring legacy. The Sengoku period transformed Japanese warfare from ritualized conflict to a calculated, highly adaptive practice. Prior to this era, battles were often formalized contests between samurai of equal standing, with an emphasis on honor, lineage, and personal skill. Yet the unrelenting violence of the Sengoku era rendered tradition insufficient. Survival demanded innovation. Leaders like Oda Nobunaga revolutionized battlefield tactics. Nobunaga combined speed, surprise, and strategic organization, integrating a Shigeru infantry alongside samurai cavalry in new formations. He understood that large numbers could be as effective as elite skill when deployed intelligently. Coordination and timing became as important as personal prowess, fundamentally changing the dynamics of Japanese warfare. Firearms, introduced by Portuguese traders in 1543, further accelerated this transformation. At Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga's strategic use of rotating volleys of arquebusiers shattered the legendary Takeda cavalry, demonstrating that innovation could outweigh centuries of tradition. Firearms required discipline, training, and organization, highlighting the need for centralized command and logistics. Siege tactics also evolved. Instead of direct assaults, leaders employed encirclement, attrition, and psychological pressure. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's siege of Odora in 1590 exemplified this method, as he surrounded the castle with tens of thousands of troops, constructed elaborate fortifications, and cut off supplies. The defenders surrendered without a direct assault, demonstrating that strategy, planning, and patience could replace brute force. The Sengoku era taught that adaptability and strategic foresight were as critical as courage and strength. Commanders who failed to innovate were swiftly eliminated, ensuring that only flexible, observant leaders could endure. Sustaining armies in the Sengoku period required unprecedented logistical planning. Armies were no longer small bands of warriors. They could number tens of thousands, requiring food, weapons, and constant coordination. Domains needed to measure agricultural output precisely to fund campaigns. Roads, ports, and transport systems became strategic assets. Leaders invested heavily in infrastructure. Nobunaga improved road networks to allow rapid troop movement. Hideyoshi implemented organized supply chains to maintain long campaigns across distant provinces. Edo later became the center of a meticulously planned transportation system, a legacy of the logistical innovations developed under wartime necessity. Coordination extended beyond material needs. Communication among commanders was critical. Flags, messengers, and drums conveyed orders across sprawling battlefields. Miscommunication could lead to disaster, and many battles were lost due to simple failures in organization. Political coordination mirrored military logistics. Alliances were constantly evaluated and managed. Daimyo switched sides strategically, negotiated marriages to solidify support, and leveraged economic resources to secure loyalty. The ability to integrate political maneuvering with battlefield tactics defined the most successful leaders. The period thus established a comprehensive understanding of military organization. Strategy, logistics, communication, and resource management were inseparable. These lessons informed Tokugawa control, creating a highly disciplined, centralized system that avoided large-scale conflict for over 2 centuries. The tactical innovations of the Sengoku period left a lasting mark on Japanese military thought. Even after the unification of Japan, the principles developed during decades of conflict influenced both strategy and governance. The use of firearms, combined arms, and coordinated formations became a standard reference for samurai education. Siege warfare, supply chain management, and intelligence gathering became integral to military training, ensuring that future generations understood the importance of preparation as much as combat skill. Psychological tactics also endured. Deception, intimidation, and displays of power were tools refined during the Sengoku era. The demonstration of overwhelming force, whether through siege construction, mass mobilization, or strategic deception, carried a legacy into Tokugawa administrative control, where symbolic authority replaced physical combat as the primary mechanism of power. The emphasis on adaptability persisted in culture and leadership. Success depended not on rigid adherence to tradition, but on understanding circumstances, responding quickly, and exploiting opportunity. The Sengoku period proved that war was a dynamic system, and that human ingenuity could dictate outcomes even against overwhelming odds. In sum, the period redefined warfare as an integrated practice of strategy, innovation, logistics, and human psychology. Its lessons shaped Japan's military, administrative, and cultural landscape for centuries, ensuring that the era of chaos influenced the country long after the last battle was fought. The Sengoku period, spanning nearly 150 years, concluded not with a single battle, but through a combination of strategy, patience, and systemic control. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi left Japan at another crossroads, but Tokugawa Ieyasu's careful approach allowed the country to transition from centuries of fragmentation to sustained centralized rule. Sekigahara in 1600 was decisive not only militarily, but symbolically. It represented the final elimination of regional independence and the beginning of the Tokugawa Shogunate's dominance. The shogunate did not merely consolidate power, it reshaped society itself. The divisions that had fueled decades of war were now formalized and controlled. Daimyo, once free to act with near autonomy, were tethered to Edo through alternating residence, marital obligations, and territorial oversight. Land redistribution and surveillance ensured that no single lord could muster enough independent force to challenge centralized authority. The destruction of the Toyotomi lineage in the summer siege of Osaka in 1615 marked the final conclusion of the Sengoku Wars. Any hope of resurrecting rebellion through a rival clan vanished. Japan entered a new era of relative stability that lasted for over 250 years. Peace, longed for by a population battered by decades of war, came at a high cost. Rigid social hierarchy, enforced obedience, and tightly controlled movement. The lessons of the Sengoku period, both political and social, were embedded into every facet of governance, ensuring that chaos would not easily return. Yet the end of war did not erase the memories or the lessons. Samurai, daimyo, merchants, and peasants carried the experiences of destruction, betrayal, and survival into this new society. The Tokugawa shogunate's longevity relied as much on the psychological legacy of the Sengoku period as on its legal and military structures. The Tokugawa period institutionalized lessons learned from the constant warfare of the Sengoku era. Samurai, once wandering warriors dependent on battlefield success, became salaried retainers, bound to a lord and trained in administration as well as martial skills. Class distinctions solidified. Farmers, artisans, and merchants each occupied prescribed social roles, with mobility tightly restricted. This stratification minimized internal conflict, but also reflected the deep-seated understanding that instability thrived on disorder and ambition unbound by rules. Economically, the era left an enduring legacy. Trade, both local and limited foreign, have been essential to sustaining prolonged military campaigns. Castle towns that emerged during the Sengoku period became commercial hubs. Roads, ports, and transport systems developed to support armies, facilitated commerce, ensuring that the post-war economy could flourish under control conditions. Even culture bore the imprint of conflict. Arts, literature, theater, and architecture, all of which evolved during warfare, became instruments of social cohesion and identity, codifying the lessons of discipline, loyalty, and strategy in aesthetically enduring forms. Religiously, the shogunate subordinated faith to authority. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and Christian communities were monitored, regulated, or, in the case of Christianity, eradicated to prevent divided loyalties. Spiritual practice continued, but it was aligned with the maintenance of order rather than independent political power. In effect, the Sengoku period's instability had taught Japan the dangerous consequences of unregulated influence, ensuring that every institution now served the central state. Although the Tokugawa era brought peace, the influence of the Sengoku period persisted for centuries. Its lessons shaped Japanese leadership, governance, military organization, and cultural identity. Leadership became synonymous with adaptability, foresight, and strategic discipline. Authority was valued not for inherited prestige alone, but for the ability to enforce order and maintain stability. Bureaucracy, social hierarchy, and strict laws emerged as tools to prevent a return to chaos. Culturally, the period's memory informed literature, theater, and art. Heroism, loyalty, betrayal, and human endurance were central themes. Samurai codes, bushido, and philosophical reflections on impermanence and resilience were direct products of centuries of violence and uncertainty. These cultural frameworks provided moral guidance and social cohesion long after swords were sheathed. Economically and infrastructurally, Japan benefited from innovations that arose from warfare. Roads, castles, urban planning, trade networks, and fiscal management systems, all developed to support constant conflict, became pillars of sustained peace. Social and political stability allowed urban life to flourish, agricultural production to increase, and commerce to expand. Above all, the Sengoku period demonstrated that chaos, while destructive, could also forge extraordinary leadership, resilience, and innovation. Japan emerged from centuries of internal warfare with a deeper understanding of strategy, survival, and social control. The transition from the age of warring states to the Tokugawa Shogunate was not merely the end of war. It was the culmination of a profound societal transformation. Power was centralized, but the lessons of disorder were never forgotten. In the end, the Sengoku period shaped Japan's political, social, economic, and cultural foundations. It was an era of blood and fire, but also one that created the conditions for centuries of peace, order, and enduring legacy. The country that emerged in the 17th century was safer, more structured, and culturally richer, but it carried within it the memory of its most chaotic age, ensuring that the lessons of ambition, betrayal, and survival would never fade. And that concludes our deep dive into the Sengoku era, the age of warring states in Japan. Today, we explored centuries of conflict, betrayal, and ambition. Following Nobunaga's ruthless rise, Hideyoshi's brilliant unification, and Ieyasu's patient strategy that brought peace. The moral of the story is clear. Survival and success often depended on adaptability, intelligence, and strategic foresight, not just strength or birthright. Loyalty, betrayal, and perseverance shaped every life, from warlords to peasants, leaving a legacy that influenced Japan for centuries. If you enjoyed this journey into Japan's turbulent past, Make sure to subscribe to History Teller YT and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We have more epic histories, battles, and untold stories coming your way. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next adventure into the past.